Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Commission. I don't think we have any apologies for absence, do we? So good to see you all here in person. And joining us remotely, we have our co-opted reps, Mansour Ahmad, Ross Gordon, and a new member, Dr. Una Stannard. Welcome especially to Dr. Stannard. Can I ask for any declarations of pecuniary interest? There being none. And let's take the minutes from two meetings. Our meeting on the 8th of September. We can take that as a correct record.
Do you put your mic on?
Put your mic on, Paul.
Hi, sorry. Can we not record the fact that the borough commander expressed her hope that we retain Wyndham Police Station and her agreement that it was suffering planning blight? I think that's important.
Perhaps she felt she'd gone as far as she could go on the subject of the police station. That
well, she did go, but I'm just recording what she said, nothing more than that. I'm not writing her script.
No, no.
Given that she said that, can't we record it in the minutes?
Yes,
you look completely shocked, Peter.
Well, those are official words, Paul, because I took it from a transcript of what she said.
More than that.
I felt she did. I felt she didn't want to go that far, if I'm honest.
Oh, well, I thought she said a lot more than that, didn't you, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's all on you. It's on YouTube.
Okay. Well, it's all on YouTube. It hardly matters, I suppose. Sorry, you waited for me. Sorry. Oh, sorry.
All right, all right. And that point noted, Paul, but let's stay with the version we have recorded. If we can come to the minutes of the call-in on the 19th of October, really brief. Can we take those as an adequate record?
I'm going to have another go. Can we not record Martin Welton saying he was going to hold Clarion, take a robust approach to Clarion in the future? Can we not include that in these minutes? He is, after all, the cabinet member. It'd be nice for him to have a mention in the minutes.
I do record him saying that, and I think that would be good to have for the record.
So
yeah,
it has been recorded in other places, but I can absolutely.
Yeah, please, yeah, okay. That's good to know that people read the minutes. I'm going to take the agenda in the order we have it here. So we're going to start with the budget and business plan. I'm going to ask our Director of Corporate Services, Caroline Holland, to give us a brief introduction and then take questions you may have for Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. So you have in front of you tonight the update and first draft of the business plan for 2022-2026. So we have gone through and updated the assumptions that we had in the MTFS that we brought to you in March to Council earlier this year. As you will see, there's been some various issues around the pay and price inflation. So pay, currently unions have rejected the 1.75% pay award. So we have changed the assumptions around the levels of pay and increased those going forward. There was also the announcement in the government's budget around there will no longer be a freeze of public sector pay. So we think that will add to expectations around pay awards and also the responsibility of the employers to then respond to those. Clearly, price inflation is an issue for us as well at the moment, and indeed mainly if for your own private purses, as it were, because with fuel, electricity, gas, all of those are increasing significantly. CPI and RPI are expected to remain high and potentially increase further during the early part of next year. So we have adjusted the level of inflation we will allow for in 22-23. The expectation is that inflation will start to fall again, so we have dropped it back down in future years. We have also looked at the level of savings that are in the current MTFS and the deliverability. So through the monitoring, you will see that there were shortfalls of savings in 2021 and 21-22. So in the table that we have in paragraph 3.2, we have added back 3.6 million of savings that are not going to be achieved. That does include the 1.5 million of the emissions-based charging. That is very unusual for us to add back savings that have not been achieved. But because of the impact of COVID, which is lasting longer than we had thought, so staff are not only responding to issues still related to COVID, they've been unable to focus on some of those savings and making sure that they could be delivered, or they are no longer deliverable because of the nature of them. We think there's little opportunity for officers to come forward with significant savings to offset those in 22-23. So you will also see there's a large change in balancing the budget reserve credit to offset some of those additional costs, because we expect there to be some potential issues around the deliverability of bringing forward savings in the short term. However, there is a significant gap in 23-24, rising further to 25-26. So that we will be bringing proposals to December Cabinet, where we'll start to have a look at what needs to be done there. Clearly, the DSG, the Dedicated Schools Grant, has also been a particular cause of concern, and indeed was for a motion at Council. We are in the midst of safety valve discussions with the DfE, one of 6 authorities this year, looking at to see if they can provide support to us in managing our deficit. It's not clear yet how much we would be able to receive as part of those discussions, or indeed clarity as to when we get it. Unlikely to hear before January at the very earliest. So that doesn't help some of the planning that we need to do in order to deliver that balanced budget for 2022-23. However, those conversations and discussions are ongoing. So clearly, after when we sort of set what those budget gaps were, we set out savings for departments based on those and using controllable budgets. But what we also said, when we looked at how we allocated the savings targets, children's schools and families had a lower factor, followed by community and housing, and then environment and regeneration and corporate services had the same weighting. So you will see in para 423 what those savings targets mean on a departmental basis. Subsequent to this report was obviously the budget announcement, and apologies. So the paper that we took to Cabinet on Monday night does have an update on the budget and the impact that might mean. So there does appear to be an increase in funding, an increase in core spending power for local authorities, but that increase in core spending power allows and assumes that you will take the maximum level of council tax increase. So the government has said that they expect the referendum limit to stay at 2% increase in council tax, but we will be allowed to levy a 1% adult social care precept. So that is new. However, our report sets out current assumptions. We had assumed the 2% increase in council tax going forward, but the adult social care levy we had not assumed, but that does not solve the budget gap. It gives additional spending to adult social care, but we will look to see if that may mean they do not need the element of inflation we may have allowed for them. But with some of our contracts in adult social care, if we need to have an uplift factor linked to inflation, that could be significantly higher than what we're paying currently. So we just need to work that through. We're unlikely to get the spending announcement and provisional settlement until middle of December. So again, that's going to be after the December Cabinet when we will be bringing forward proposals to you. There was also an announcement of £2.6 billion worth of capital spend for SEND, but it's not clear how that will be allocated and over what time period. But clearly, as part of our response to tackling that DSG deficit, we have been increasing provision for places, and we would look to see if we can increase further resources to be able to reduce the amount of children who need to go outside the council and outside of our own provided schools and into the private sector. We want to try and maintain those as closely as possible. So the paper that went to Cabinet on Monday night had some proposals around the draft capital programme and also an update, a wider update on the spending review. The draft capital programme will be coming back again to you as part of the proposals that you'll be considering as in the scrutiny meetings in January. So whilst it's been tabled for you, for some of you tonight and circulated earlier today, thank you to Rosie, don't feel that this is your only chance to comment on it. It will be coming back again, and we will be taking you through much more detail what that means. But you'll see there are some significant items in there dealing with the vehicle impact of climate change, as well as some proposals to help with converting accommodation for care leavers. There's some significant SIL funding that we've utilised to try and reduce the impact on the revenue and capital borrowing, as well as maximising external sources of grant funding as well. But happy to take any questions on either paper or just general observations around the budget and the process. Thank you.
Let me get my question in first, then who else is asking? On the balancing the budget reserve on page 24, does that include your allowance for the DSG deficit?
We've not currently made any changes to the DSG budgets and provisions that we've agreed at council. We are looking at the impact of the current in-year monitoring. So at month 6, the deficit was 12.6 million. So that's factoring into some of the conversations we're having with the DfE to see how that works through. But that use of the balance in the budget reserve has had no impact or change at the moment on the DSG. We will look to bring an update to either December or January Cabinet once we know more then.
Thank you, Chair. Following on from your question, Caroline, you mentioned about the provision you're providing for SEND within Merton, and hopefully with more in-borough provision, it will save funds rather than the current numbers who are going outside of Merton, and we have to perhaps pay more plus travelling costs. With parents still having the parental choice of where they want to go, are you confident that what's going on will be enough to not perhaps reduce it totally, but reduce it significantly to start making a reduction in a very expensive area of education? These children have to be provided for, yes, but will we be able to cover them where parents will willingly come to us rather than go outside, which is their choice to choose somewhere outside of Merton?
So part of the overall strategy is that clearly we do have very good and outstanding special schools, and any new provision would be linked directly to one of those. So the offer we think is good, and it's working with parents, with schools, and with some of our assessors and health colleagues to make sure that we're building the right provision to be able to utilise those spaces appropriately. There will always be some children that we cannot cater for because their needs are just too great. But we're working around the type of provision that's required, doing some further analysis around the children coming through and into the system. We have some children, as young as 4, costing significant amounts of money, and those children will be in effectively sort of external provision for the rest of their school life. But it's how we can work with schools, particularly primary schools, because we lose children from primary schools into the external sector at secondary school level. How can we ensure that they can stay within the system? Parents have the confidence to be able to do that. And indeed making sure that we're very clear on the options and helping parents make the right selection. So that's going to be part of the work we're looking to do.
Your provision for inflation is 1.5%. That's on page 15, paragraph 4. And yet the Bank of England is expected to rise to 4% and to cut back to 2%, according to the Bank of England. So why are you keeping us at 1.5? Page 15, paragraph 4.
So we did originally have inflation at 1.5%.
Yeah.
However, we have changed it going forward to 2.5% for 22-23, and then dropped it down purely because we cannot afford 4.5%. We've never fully provided for the level of inflation. Not all lines of the budget attract inflation costs. So, and normally departments have been able to manage within that, but we're just conscious there may be certain areas where we do need to provide certain increases to inflation. We've also done that for utilities at the moment. So we've built some additional money in for the utility bills because we are seeing certain pressures coming through. We do have some long range contracts, but we came out of the contract for some of the schools with the issues we've had with the PFI contract. So we are seeing some significant increases there as well. So we're trying to balance likely levels with what we anticipate, but we keep it constantly under review.
Sorry, a few questions and apologies for the naivety. My first question is the process one. I'd like to understand why, if this paper went to Cabinet on Monday, it was only sent to us today. Many of us have only just seen it in the last hour. Many of us have jobs. To send stuff out on the day makes it impossible for us to actually read the papers. So I'd like to understand how agenda item 5 changes the paper we have. I've worked out, I think, that we've doubled the inflation provision from $250,000 to $500,000. But if you could just outline to me how this dovetails with the paper I'd read and tried to understand. So that's my second question. My third question is, the new paper refers to a timetable in Appendix 1, which I can't find. Perhaps it means the timetable in the old paper. And there, I just want to get my head round why the financial outturn for 2019-20 is relevant, or is that just a misprint? I mean 2021 there, or on page 29 of the agenda items. And my next question, I suspect you will just laugh at being totally naive. What happens to, we learned at FMTG that there was a favourable outcome of 8.5 million. Has that just been squirreled away now in reserves, or does that come in anywhere? So that's my questions. Thank you, Caroline.
So I may need some help sort of answering, of picking them up all again. If I start with the last one first. So the 8.4 million, yes, that went into reserve. So that set up a reserve, for example, £2 million climate change, £1 million for your Merton. We topped up the apprenticeship reserve. We topped up balance in the budget reserve. So some of that has helped with that then use of the 9.6 million for balancing that budget in 22-23. So when we bring the final paper back to February Cabinet and March Council, it will show how we've utilised things. And in that table on para 3.6, you will see I've had to use in the short term 450,000 of the climate change monies. So we've added it back in 2024-25, which is when Environment and Regeneration think that they're going to be spending and calling down on that money. So in the Cabinet paper on the financial monitoring on Monday night, we drew down the first 2 years tranches of the climate change monies. So that was that one. The main change between the paper that went to October and November is the capital programme and the bids. And it was my fault. I missed that you didn't get it early enough. And when we submitted the paper for Cabinet, we should have sent it out to you as well. So that's on me. But as I said, you'll have plenty of opportunity to reconsider it back in January's scrutiny panels. But I just wanted to make sure, in some ways you had the latest information, but apologies, then it's come too late for you to have that information. But that's part of that timetable and process. So certainly the timetable that's set out in the October report, perhaps I think that is a typo, shouldn't refer to 2021 outturn. Yeah, so that outturn should have been 2021, not 1920. So apologies. We try and utilize where possible and reuse. So yes, we missed that. So that's what that did mean. Is that all of them?
Thank you, Chair. Caroline, following on from Paul's question, can you give me some background on the £1 million that's been set aside and the growth for your Merton? I understand what your Merton is, but that seems to be an awful lot of money being set aside. How that's possibly going to be deployed or what it's been set aside for?
So it was set aside to utilise in the short term for the priorities and that have come out of your Merton. So it links probably with the next item on the agenda, sort of showing the outcomes and that. So certainly one of the first outcomes, and indeed at Cabinet on Monday night, the first tranche of that £1 million was drawn down to utilise for street scene works. So 250,000 will be spent on those in the short to medium term. We're waiting to see what the other proposals that come forward are. Each of the directors and departments have been tasked with doing some work in the short term. Clearly medium to longer term. So you'll see again in that table in 3.6 that we said longer term, there will be impacts of your Merton to come forward. And we don't know what that will be at this stage and how it links then with how the priorities will change. Because clearly there will be a new administration in May, and also there may be some changes to that as well. So we just wanted to flag that there are some items still to come. And it may have a positive or it may have a negative impact on those gaps, but I wanted to drip feed you in and sort of say, rather than kind of come forward in January and go, oh, no, we need this. It's sort of a trailer of things still to come, but you will be involved as part of that process.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Caroline. I just wanted to pick up one point you mentioned about maximising grant funding. If you could, I've got a follow-up, but if you wouldn't mind just elaborating further on how you and colleagues work to maximise that, and whether it's a decentralised or centralised approach would be helpful.
Some of it is a decentralised approach because some of the grants that we get are very specific. So example of grants is the disabled facilities grants, so which we use for adaptations in people's homes, both for children and for adults. So trying to maximise the use of that as much as possible enables people to be discharged from hospital, or it can enable people to stay independent in their own home, which is what we want to encourage as much as possible. There's clearly LIP funding that comes through from TfL. So again, trying to maximise and align our priorities around cycle networks, the roadworks, maximising that as much as possible as well. There are very few capital grants that don't have conditions attached to them. So we do have significant grants within children's schools and families to expand our schools or to maintain our schools. And that's why we need to see what the conditions are attached to the £2.6 billion worth of capital SEN spend, over what time period, and how we can sort of tap into that as well, because there can be bidding rounds as well for some of these programs of funding, and it's making sure then we've got the schemes that align with what we need to do. There are times when we will bid for things which weren't necessarily in our program, but we would have wanted to do, but it wasn't a priority within our current resources. But if there are funding streams we can tap into, then we'll certainly look to maximise those as well.
Sorry, Chair, just briefly following up on that. So is there a monetary, is there a number threshold, or is it more on a strategic basis? I ask because again, thinking about sustainable communities, I know that, or I believe there to be an underutilization of the landfill tax grant. So there's grant up to six providers that are within our area, where per project we can get up to £50,000. So it's to trying to understand how, where there is an underutilization and some variation, and there is some additional projects no doubt coming out, we'll hear later on, how is that coordinated, or when do you give the tap on the shoulder to say, hey, I think you're underutilizing here, or we can work together and do this a bit better? How does that actually work?
So I would draw on sort of the colleague to my left about sort of the work that's done within the policy and partnerships team, which will look and find sort of sources of funding that may be available and come out. So the latest updates that come through from government departments, what's available. The ones I've referred to are mainly capital grants, but there are revenue grants as well. So again, it's looking at the networks. There's no limit per se, but for capital schemes, it's normally over £10,000. That's what we will add to the programme. Anything else we would deem to below that level to be revenue funding. We do look to see what the conditions are attached to some of those grants. We have turned down some previous GLA funding because of the conditions attached. Meant that we no longer had full control over the asset, and that wasn't something we were prepared to give up in those circumstances. So that's also what we need to be aware of, and does it fit with what we want to do? So it's, if we can get sources of funding in, so we'll have seen whether we do have significant COVID grants that have come through, trying to maximise the use of those in the first instance, but also making sure if we think there are still going to be pressures in the following years, can we work and sort of say to government, please allow us to carry forward some of this funding, because some of the test and trace will still be needed come April. So we will still need resources, and we currently have over nearly 37 staff working on that at the moment. So that work isn't going to go away anytime soon.
Thank you.
Yes, Caroline, if I can, on page 26, the savings targets, and as I look at the remaining 3 years of the MTFS after next year, it's very much loaded. Well, 70% of those savings actually are loaded on to 23-24. Is that of necessity, or I mean, it seems an awful lot, particularly as you can see the gap moving from 1.1 million to 17 million. An awful lot to take in one stride, isn't it?
It certainly does, and I think there was an increase in the gap when we brought the paper to you in March from 3.9 million to 11.5 million. But because we've utilised significantly the balance in the budget reserve, that's therefore increased the impact in 23-24. Clearly, we are currently showing an overspend in month 6 monitoring. If that position changes, that may help. So to have some further underspend to put into the balance in the budget to then release some monies for 23-24, depending on the outcomes of the conversations with the DfE, then that may reduce that 23-24 figure further. And clearly the settlement, we've made some assumptions around the settlement, depending on if they're looking to do any fair funding review in the settlement, where they were looking to move money around. Michael Gove was saying yesterday about places which had a stable council tax base and stable business rates, they could potentially lose money to the rest of the country. What we don't know if that is from April, and what we don't know is who do they consider to have a stable council tax base. If you saw on Monday night, the review of our council tax base, particularly for the council tax support scheme, that has changed, but has improved over last year, but there was a significant reduction because of the impact of COVID. So we're just waiting to see what that has. So these numbers could change come January, when we'll have the update from this provisional settlement to feed in. Fingers crossed it will. And we've got some of our scenarios right. If we've got it very wrong, then we're in trouble. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it in January.
I'm sure you'll get it very right. Unless there are further questions, then I will thank Caroline for that presentation and look forward to seeing you again in January, Caroline, for the next stage. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, well, thank you. Let's come on now to our presentation from Rob Francis of Traverse on your Merton. So you may, and
Chair,
Frank. Sorry,
I'll do a quick introduction and then
Please
hand over to Rob.
Yeah.
I should first of all
Frank
say that I'm substituting for both Chris Lee and for John Dimmer. I don't know whether I'll be able to cover all of what they would have covered. So I'll say a little bit about the origins of this piece of work. And this is the Your Merton initiative that the council alluded to earlier. And then after Rob has presented the findings, I'll just give a little brief summary of next steps and some indication of the immediate activity that's underway. So in terms of the origin of this, it's really come out of a clear sense, and I think lots of local authorities are doing this sort of thinking, of needing to understand the impact of the pandemic on residents and their perceptions and experiences of the pandemic, and what that means particularly for their aspirations for the borough, for their communities, and for their neighbourhoods. And I think you'll find that there's some really interesting findings that have come out of the work that we commissioned. We did bring in a specialist partner, that's Traverse, and Rob Francis is here this evening from Traverse to present the findings. It ran alongside, and I won't say too much about the approach because Rob will explain that. It did run alongside the residents survey, and I think it did provide us with a wealth of information around residents, their perceptions and experiences of the pandemic. And I think it's given us a very good basis on which to start thinking about and developing initiatives and plans for taking forward some of those aspirations that we've heard. It's probably the largest exercise that's been undertaken, I understand, it's at least in the last decade within the borough. So I think has huge value. We're also supplementing it with all the data and analysis from the socioeconomic indicators that we gather regularly, but that's also supporting the understanding of what happens in the borough and what needs to happen in the borough. So I'll now hand over to Rob, who'll take you through the findings. And then obviously there's an opportunity for councillors to ask questions, and then I'll say a little bit about next steps. Thank you, Chair.
That one. There we go, that's better. So we're an employee-owned research engagement organisation, work around the UK, and we work primarily with public service. I'm the head of our public sector work. We also have a head of health, and we have voluntary sector work as well. There are a lot of overlaps, of course, because lots of the most complex stuff that you're doing involves partners. And we've done various kinds of work over the last few years, similar to this around vision, setting vision, helping people set vision for places, involving communities in that work. You're the only one we know of sort of recently that's done this as the pandemic is kind of as we're emerging from that period. And it feels like a very interesting time to do it. We really enjoyed doing this work with you. So the presentation I'll share is something some of you will have seen before in previous sessions recently. So sorry if you're hearing it the second time. What were we asked to do? So we were asked to put together a piece of work that would engage residents in thinking about the future of where they live, where they work, where they study, experiences of that. So how do people feel about where they live and work? What do they find frustrating? What do they want for the future? What are their experiences of the pandemic specifically during this period of the last 18 months, 2 years? Does that change things about how they feel about the place and what they want for it, what they prioritize? And therefore, yes, those two things together, creating this sense of what is the priority for the future, what are they most interested in seeing in their local patches. There were 4 separate activities that we led. One was via a partner, a market research partner, so this big 1,000-person survey. It was 1,005 with an adult sort of survey, and then I think 100 young people as well did a supplementary survey. If you think of it in terms of a pyramid, that was the most participation was from the survey, because that's what surveys enable you to do, reach more people. But in a more kind of shallow way, you can't go and have those conversations as you would in a focus group or in another kind of workshop setting. But they give you there's a lot of people involved in that process at the bottom of that pyramid. One step up, you've got 500 people contributed via this open access website run by Commonplace, another partner of ours. That's more qualitative. People can go on there and fill in free text boxes. So some put a few lines, some put reams and reams. As you can imagine, that does not, you don't get a reflective sample from that kind of process, because people who are more proactive, more interested, more perhaps confident in their opinions might use that sort of platform, whereas the survey is a random sample across the borough covering the different wards. Going up a stage again, we then have these 13 local community organisations supported us by running some focus groups with their members, their service users. This was to try and reach groups who might not be so prominent in the online platform work, or who may be sort of seldom heard in other ways, in general engagement and in being heard by the council or other partners locally. And I'll show you a slide in a moment which lists the groups that were helping us out there. And also the idea was these may be groups disproportionately affected by inequalities or by the results of the pandemic. At the very top of that pyramid, so a very small number of people, but very in-depth work. We had 25 residents recruited to reflect broadly, as much as you can with such a small number, the diversity of the borough from different parts of the borough, through 2 deliberative workshops. So by that we mean people were shown information, shown sort of data from these earlier parts of the process, and asked to reflect on those. So each level sort of builds on the last. So the survey kind of kicked off first. That was giving us, even as it was still going on, was giving us some emerging data around what people are saying, what they're thinking, which we could then feed into the other conversations and get people to reflect on what their peers, their neighbours are saying. So that was a process that we went through. Okay, just you can see there, it might be too small, but there's a range of groups there that were involved from across the borough in helping us to reach those groups that are more seldom heard in this kind of work. In the report, you can sort of read about that in more detail. There are different reports to look at. There's the report that the sort of Traverse led on, which is the kind of engagement across the piece, looking at those 4 different phases I just spoke about. There's also a separate survey report, which looks in detail at the survey findings, which will give you more of the sort of drill down data around different parts of the borough, where there's variation or different age groups, different ethnicities and so on. That comes through that report especially. So I just want to focus in this short presentation on some of the things that come out from across the board. So if you sort of stand back and take a bird's eye view of those different phases of work, what stands out? And I don't suppose there's things that will be very surprising, but I think taken together, they are interesting. And I think the overlaps, intersections can be interesting for you to think about as well. So in terms of assets, people talked a lot about the green spaces, the parks, how much they valued those, how much they felt that made them proud of the borough, but it was perhaps made it different to other places around London, so they're very proud of that. There was a vibrant community came through as a thing people are proud of, and I think particularly around the pandemic, people felt the community had really sort of stepped up, and they felt particularly proud of and pleased about what they were seeing in their neighbourhoods in different ways. And there were conversations we had in some of our groups around how can we sustain some of that beyond the pandemic? How can some of those great things we saw in our neighbourhoods, our streets, be sustained beyond the crisis of the pandemic? There were some frustrations around traffic and litter, sort of cleanliness, and you see that in lots of London boroughs, you'd expect, but and I think it's interesting how this intersects with some stuff that comes later around high streets and sort of feeling of pride in places. So there was this sort of real ambition around communities seeing regenerated high streets that were more of a hub for their community. Of course, people want good shops and commercial stuff in high streets, but also people talked a lot about how the high street is a place where they see their community coming together, potentially a place to physically meet and do stuff and meet friends and family, but also sort of a signifier of the place and characterizing the place. And therefore, if it feels kind of run down and unloved, that reflects on the place, and they feel like it's harder to be proud of where you're living if your high street isn't that good. So high street came through quite strongly. Attractiveness, regenerating places, what's in our high streets came through the survey, came through the Commonplace website, came through the conversations we had in focus groups. So that was quite strong. And maximising the green space. As I said before, people love the green space in the parks. They asked, how can we make the most of those for our health and well-being, for our young people, How can we do things like run events there which help to overcome isolation that we've experienced during COVID, which is one of the things that the impact of the pandemic came through on, and how can we also use any kind of public space, particularly green space, to really sort of foster that kind of community spirit, coming together type stuff that people have missed, but again, people think is kind of latent in their neighborhoods and they want to celebrate more of. So those are kind of the high level things that came through quite strongly across the work. Just a little bit of detail on some of those then. Yes, green space, important in helping residents kind of maintain their physical and mental well-being, as you'd expect. People talked a lot about the kind of environmental, biodiversity, climate change associations with green space as well, and the importance of nurturing those and doing more with them. Community, I think, was more important for people, was difficult to define for people. And so the survey, it's hard to get an awful lot from that beyond its importance, but in the workshops, I think we got a bit more. So people appreciate it, particularly during the pandemic, as I say. There's some very hyper local level stuff going on there around mutual aid groups in neighborhoods, around community organizations and the role they play to help people through the difficult time they'd had. And there's this sort of connection between the sense of community and the built environment. So people sort of thought in similar terms around, if we have accessible, vibrant, pleasant high streets, we have clean parks, attractive housing developments, that helps us be proud of where we come from. It helps us have places to come and mingle and congregate and want to stay here and invest our time and our kind of family life and stay ever longer in the place. So those things kind of converged. On the frustration side, yes, litter and traffic came through in the survey and came through some of the conversations as well. Again, this sort of general feeling that if the place doesn't look kind of nice, if I don't want to spend time there, it's not a place that I kind of feel so proud of, and wanting to change that. And these are kind of the sort of day-to-day things that councils and councillors are familiar with a lot, but it feels like it kind of underpins everything else. So whilst there's not much here about kind of ambition and vision for the future, the feeling was if you can't sort of get these things to feel right where you live, then it's hard to be ambitious about the big stuff. Traffic congestion was a frustration for pedestrians, cyclists and motorists themselves. There were a couple of issues around parking people raised, again, which are probably historic and not particularly new. What was interesting, we'll come to in a minute, was different feelings about traffic and kind of convenience of the car. So people wanted to be able to get around in their cars and park and all that sort of stuff. But when we looked at the future of high streets, people talked in terms of, well, if it's a convenient place and it's just a place I pop into for a few bits and pieces, I want to be able to get there in my car, park quite nearby, and then just be gone again. If it's a place that I really want to spend time with my children and families and sort of and have a coffee and have dinner, if I'm going to invest more time in it, I don't mind taking a bit longer to get there or having to walk a bit further from the car park. So kind of investing in the place had a sort of an implication on what people felt about the convenience of getting to it, which was maybe interesting. On the experience of the pandemic stuff, again, things not surprisingly, a negative impact of not seeing friends and family came through very strongly across the different phases of the work that we did. The isolation, and I think through some of our focus groups with seldom heard groups in particular, came through very strongly, whereas people were experiencing people on low incomes, or where they particularly needed services and they found it hard to get access to stuff. So feeling that isolation very strongly, that came through the conversations we had. Education and work concerns. I think about 70% of the sort of young people had some concern around the future of their sort of education being affected by the period of the pandemic. And this idea of a community-led recovery, even if people didn't use that terminology, a really big theme throughout the work, I think joining together again some of the different elements of this, is an increased appreciation for the community where people lived during the pandemic, because of lifestyles changing, people being at home more, commuting less, going on walks from their front door every day, which I hadn't done perhaps before, really gave people a much more local focus than they perhaps had before, and therefore feel much more invested in and want to take pride in and see better things in their immediate community, where perhaps for some people that didn't matter so much when they weren't spending so long in their houses. On the high streets, so revitalized high streets, yeah, very important to people. Just the aesthetic of it, the kind of feeling of wanting to be in the place. People really long to see sort of change in some of those areas, or maintaining where they have nice things, they feel nice high streets for sort of sustaining that. This idea of the community hub in the high street was interesting. In the deliberation work we did towards the end of the process with our sample of 25, we gave people some scenarios around different versions of high street futures. And one was sort of residential led, with perhaps having more housing in centres to make it more viable, make high streets more viable. One had sort of the idea of big kind of corporates having kind of big centres, distribution kind of warehousey places in centres where you could get stuff really easily, like Argos type sort of facilities, but it wouldn't be very sort of characterful and very different in each area. People really kind of rejected those and wanted to see places that were different and distinctive and were different to the place down the road, and wanted to see investment that made the place feel distinctive. And again, a place people could be proud of and want to spend their time in, whether they're shopping there or doing other things there. Accessible and traffic free, as I said in those workshops, was this idea that if the place is good enough, I don't mind if it isn't quite so easy to get to, or to stay there, or to park there, because people wanted perhaps that more pedestrianised open air feel. And some people talked about it being if it's worth it, then I wouldn't mind some of those sort of lack of convenience if I'm going to a nice place and spending more time there. Green spaces, people wanted them to be safe and accessible, not surprising. Places for community activity, where people can come together from different backgrounds and get to know each other, use the place kind of equally and fairly. Places where you can perhaps generate income. So can we have big events in parks that enable us to make some money to then do other things in parks within reason? And a big theme, I think, for a lot of people was around climate change. That was on their minds through lots of these conversations, and therefore how can we perhaps rewild some of our green spaces and maximise their impact, their benefit in our climate change efforts locally. So I just wanted to sort of tie up that bit of the presentation with this slide to try and reflect the way that we felt things were overlapping in those conversations, whereby the high street is, yes, a place for commercial stuff and for shopping, but how people talked about it through the lens of community, and a place that is at the heart of their neighbourhood, and therefore reflects really strongly on their neighbourhood and the quality of that place, and a place where we can kind of come together. And this concern that if, for instance, you had like a residential development in a high street setting, would that make it feel less inclusive for other people who didn't live there? Would it be less a place where you could come together and sort of mix and mingle because it was more residential? So people had concerns about how you regenerate the high street. Now, some of those might be unfounded, but the way they thought about it and talked about it, I think, was interesting. And green space and community, as I talked about there was interest in how you make the most of those spaces to bring people together in different ways. Just a few quotes there. There were loads of quotes. There's lots more in the report. Top left there. I live and work here. However, there is not a single place I would go for a coffee, lunch, or evening meal or drink. It's so run down, shabby, and ugly. It's quite a negative comment there, obviously. Litter and fly tipping sometimes make me want to move away. That idea of the kind of very simple day-to-day stuff, getting people down when they look out their window and see that kind of thing. I discovered the joys of Morden Park and walked to my local area more than I have done in 15 years I've lived here. That idea of being more invested in the place, noticing things more during the pandemic. If you can only afford a short-term rental, you'll never truly feel part of the community. There were some conversations about housing and ownership, and the sort of idea that if I can't invest in a place here, or I can't stay here for a long time, it's hard for me to invest my love in the place and my time in the place and my energy. So how can we help everybody to stay part of the place where they're living and they're growing up? We started a garden in our street. The amazing response I've received illustrates that the community is desperate for initiatives which bring it together and enhance the living environment. And the neighborhood became more connected, and it was lovely to have people out walking. And of course, through the traffic disappeared for a few months. Again, impact of the pandemic, helping people to reflect on what they wanted for the future of that place beyond this period we're living in at the moment. So those are some of the things that came through the work, and where I think some of those connections are interesting to think about. Okay, so what does that give you? Looking across the findings, I think there's an overarching ambition for a future of Merton where people feel safe, of course, included, connected. Those are kind of key things that stand out across that work. To achieve this, I guess the vision needs to do some of these things. Bring people together and build community, building on some of the success of the pandemic in that respect. Responding to the frustrations about public space that people have, those day-to-day things that get people down about where they live. Nurture character, identity, and sense of ownership. That was really strong through the high street conversations, particularly about identity and different, what makes our place different, a place I can be proud of. Recognizing the trade-offs inherent in different futures. And I think the risk in any vision work is that you just have a shopping list of nice things. And everyone wants the best schools and the best hospitals and the best high streets. So how do you get beyond that and use the vision to really help to create something a little bit more nuanced? And in our deliberative work, we sort of try to do that, where we got people thinking about if you can have this, but you can't have this, then what is your preference? So a vision which tries to give some sense of direction around some of these things is more useful than one that just lists all nice stuff. I think the engagement shows that residents were really passionate about the potential of their areas and are keen to be involved in decisions around its strategic direction. And that last point, I think, is really important. When we do engagement work, we often find that people who might turn up to something or fill in a survey may be not thinking a great deal about these issues before they've been asked a question. When you get into a conversation with people, they really have a lot to say, a lot they want to contribute, and they leave saying things like, how can I do more of this again? When's the next thing like this? Or if only we could do more things like this with our neighbours to sort of plan things together about where we live. So I'd encourage you to think about the visioning process, not just as a product at the end, but a thing which points towards a way to work with local people. Okay, so these are just some reflections I was invited by the team to give based on having done this in other places and some of the kind of risks of doing this. So first of all, I think there's a risk that anything like this becomes a report that sits on a shelf, and that you kind of silo-wise the vision setting work. And so who's going to go and deliver the vision over there in the corner of the organization, when really it kind of works better in our experience when it is sort of threaded throughout an organization and your partners. How do you sort of use this to light little fires and to sort of get things moving in different places, so it isn't just a thing that team over there goes and deals with. That's really the second point as well. And there's also just the risk that this sort of work is really rich and insightful if you look at the detail and the kind of quotes that come through, and it really connects to what people are feeling and thinking day to day, but it can be all reduced to a sort of bland, predictable set of statements. And around the country, everyone has their kind of cleaner, safer, greener sort of statements, and that's the same everywhere. So how do you do something which is sort of different and feels distinctive and feels local to you? And of course within Merton as well, there's variation in some of these things within the borough. So how do you kind of pick that up in your localities, so you can sort of take these overall, an overarching vision, say, what does that mean, what does that look like through the lens of our particular ward, our particular neighbourhood? Just some thoughts about what you might do on the positive side with this. Again, based on stuff we've done elsewhere, similarly over the last few years, it really works well when you use it as a springboard. So use it to open up conversations with officers across the council and with partners, and encouraging them to use the findings in ways that are creative and cross-cutting, looking at those intersections of things, not trying to kind of divide up into different boxes, but look at what the similarities are and the connections between the issues that are coming through. So what does that mean for us? What do these priority topics mean related to what we do? Getting everybody to think about that in their different bit of the organisation, their different bit of the system, can be really useful and can sort of throw up some new ideas. It's a bit of a sort of daft phrase, but treat the findings as plasticine, not marble. I think we'd encourage people who do this kind of work to not think about stuff that's set in stone, but to look at the material, look at the findings, and move things around, play with them, think about what's that meaning if I look at the other data that we've already got, or what I know from my local surgery, so I'm a counsellor, what are the things that I can do that how is this kind of useful to us beyond the sort of the static thing in front of me as a set of data? How can I use this to have interesting conversations? And finally here, seeing vision creation as a vehicle for starting new conversations and trying new approaches. Again, not a product in itself. A vision, a set of statements, is only so helpful. It can be a guide for things, but really the actions that flow from it, of course, what matters. And I think the processes it can invite people to take part in are as important as the product itself. There's one more here, exploring how to take these conversations out into communities. So, as I said, there's appetite, I think, everywhere when we do this kind of work to do more like this. And that doesn't mean more consultation, because I think people are fatigued with that, as you'll experience, but it's sort of different types of conversations, different ways to connect people up and join the dots around some of the issues that are coming through here can be really valuable. That is it. Any questions or thoughts? Do I need to turn my mic off so others can get theirs on or not? I'm going to retire there so everybody's going to take notes. So.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. Having done similar presentations myself, I won't ask questions that would need you to quickly, go through detailed notes and data tables and things like that. So I'll try and avoid those. Just a few questions then. But in terms of the first question, in terms of the methodology of it, it's very hard to be representative with these things. Easier in large surveys, but in terms of focus groups, very difficult to get a total vision, total voice from a borough setting. So I was just wondering if you could summarize the things that aren't, perhaps covered by representativeness in the survey and the focus groups. Leading on to my second question, it seems like one of the themes through there was people who own their homes perhaps felt a lot more ownership of the place, maybe even had a lot more to say about the local area, whereas more transient residents maybe not. What was the breakdown of those types of people in the survey and the focus groups, and are there very different themes between them? And that final point there, you mentioned there's a few quotes there. I'm wondering if they're representative as well of the wider feeling of this getting together and talking about their local area was in itself a good experience. Was there any evidence of what types of engagement they would want in the future? Is it the council or the local authority facilitating community groups and conversations rather than consultations like this? Sorry, a few questions there.
Okay, thanks. So on the last one first, I mean, we didn't ask specifically about what kind of things you'd like to be involved in future. I think element of this, our consultation, or element of the survey is what a survey is. It is quite a blunt instrument, but it gives you a lot of data. So there probably isn't much appetite for those, but they are quite quick to do, so people don't seem to mind doing them. I think the people really enjoy the deliberative sort of conversational stuff. We have this facilitated conversation. So whether it's the council doing that or someone else, I don't think matters too much. I think, I mean, this is more from wider experience. People value some sort of independently led kind of facilitated conversation that doesn't feel like it's got an agenda to it. They don't like feeling they're being sort of shoved in certain directions. And that can be a thing that people do themselves. And I think what was nice through our community groups, the 13 organizations, they ran those sessions themselves. We sort of did an introduction and sort of training around it, and then they did it themselves because there was trust there. And sometimes with certain groups in particular, you'll find less trust of someone coming in, asking questions. So I think just working with partner organizations and having a networked approach to doing that and doing it different ways is normally the best way to do it, because different people respond well to different things. On the point about sort of homeowners, I need to look at the data for that. I don't know if there was a particularly strong sense that those who owned homes had a sort of strong investment in it. I think the quote reflected the idea that whether you're renting or owning, just not feeling that you're stable in where you're living affects your sort of ability to invest in, emotionally, the place where you are. So I'm not sure if that's about ownership as such. And there might be something in the data on the survey. Anything smaller than the survey, there wouldn't be enough to sort of give you a sample for that. On the representativeness issue, so yes, the survey gives you that most robustly because of the nature of it. It's random sampling, so sort of household lists around the borough, so different wards are represented fairly, and within that there's some data in the survey part of the report which shows you the profile of that, which is pretty well spread. The commonplace survey normally, as I said, is more people who are perhaps weighted towards older people or more interested in, will sort of come forward to give their views on things. So that is less representative or less reflective, we would say. But it wasn't bad. And I think, again, I need to look at the data, but I think there was a pretty good range of people, but probably wouldn't reflect exactly your population. But there was a range of views came through and a range of people took part in it. And there were 500, so that was pretty good in terms of numbers for something which is proactively done and there's no incentive or anything else like that. The 13 focus groups, I think, there was no way to sample those. We just invited groups to come forward and offer to run them. But we were really pleased with the range we had. And I think the risk with any kind of sampling process, we've been doing climate assemblies lately in some areas, is that you can sort of sample all sorts of different elements of the population. And if you have 50 people, you say, well, 1 should be disabled and 2 should be this or 4 should be that. And there's a risk that you end up sort of seeing that as representative, and it isn't. It's kind of reflective, but you can't claim that there's 1 or 2 people reflect that whole community that sits behind them. So I think the power of those focus groups was you had people in their existing community groups, organizations they were trusting, having conversations about things that mattered to them particularly, whether it was a particular group of ethnicity or particular part of, on people on low incomes or disabled people. So I think those groups are particularly valuable for amplifying voices that don't come through other types of conversation. And so that's where you're trying to get some sort of redressing the balance that you might not get in, say, an open access website. And finally, the sampling, 25 people in our deliberative session, very, very small. You wouldn't claim that's representative in any way, but it did reflect, we did try and get a spread in terms of age, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, and ward, which matched the borough in that very small setting. And what was interesting in those conversations, where people did, we did put them in kind of broad locality groupings, same sort of things came through. So whether you lived in an area where the high street was seemed to be a bit shabbier, or in a sort of a nicer, in quotes, area with a nicer high street, people said the same things about identity and sort of and pride of place and what they wanted from where they lived, although the setting was a bit different. So lots of commonality came through across the different areas, which is interesting.
If I may, first a question from Mansour, and then I'll come to you, Aidan and John.
Thanks,
Mansour,
Chair.
can we have your question?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Rob Francis. It was really nice and comprehensive presentation, and we really appreciate. I've got a question. It's regarding strategic plan and action to improve traffic congestion in future. Please.
So that was like the strategic plan, was that right?
Yeah.
So that's probably a question for officers about the kind of the response to this. So there might be, I don't know if anyone really wants to comment on the sort of what will happen with the findings, but I think that's probably.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. It's a really important question, because this is a listening exercise. And first off, I think tonight we should focus on the listening exercise. As I was discussing with a couple of people beforehand, the reason, one of the many reasons it was outsourced is, one is because they're very good at what they do, but secondly is because it creates an objective answer. These are the answers. Just as you've heard there, you know, they use a different sort of engagement methods to get this sort of objective truth from people, and it isn't people posing questions in a way. So these are the issues that are honest to those people. These are the issues that are true to those people's perceptions. Now, therefore, they are very much what frames the problem for those of us who are in politics, regardless of which political party. That's the words they're the words that frame the problem, and it's up for us to come up with the solutions, no matter which party we're in going forward and which party wins next May. Obviously, we're going to look to do a response. We've heard earlier that there is some funding set aside for a short, immediate response to some of the immediate issues, but that's different from what I think you're talking about, which is a long-term strategic vision. I think it'll be incumbent upon everyone here, all four parties represented, come up with some kind of strategic vision in response to this. The one thing I will say, and I've said this to other people, is that what we're hearing from this is what people want, okay? And we need to be careful of something that I sometimes call the sort of tyranny of the majority, is that you must be careful that in any strategic vision, we include what the minority of people need as well, because we do have statutory responsibilities and moral responsibilities as a council to provide services for those peoples whose voices aren't as big, as loud, or as frequent. And therefore not represented to the same degree in these spaces, and they need to be part of any vision. But going forward, there will be, I'm sure, strategic visions and an idea on how to meet the issues that have been, or the questions that have been posed by this study. I don't know if Frank, you want to say anything else?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. Yeah, so just in terms of some immediate next steps, the full findings of the Traverse work have now been published. And I think all councillors should have been emailed with a link to those findings, so you can explore that in more detail. And obviously, we're happy to then talk to you further about the findings if you come back with any other questions. Officers are looking at immediate responses to some of what's come out of the findings. So that's the 1 million fund that you referred to in your earlier discussion. And already there is some initiatives identified, particularly around street scene, but there are other immediate initiatives that we can start to develop, and indeed are in the pipeline already around health advice in the high streets. continuing grant support to business and so on. Those are immediate actions that we're starting to put in place in response to these findings. But there will, of course, be, and I'm sure you've got a sense of this, there will be some medium to long-term activity that we need to develop as officers. So, for instance, if we take the high streets, it's likely that any plans and proposals around the high streets will be at least on a, I'd suggest, a 4 to 5 year timescale for delivery. But we're already starting to do that thinking as well on the officer side. And we are starting to engage with other stakeholders in this. So we had a very useful session with the Merton Partnership, so the police, health, local business representatives, Chamber of Commerce and so on Monday. And that's, and picking up Rob points, that's about continuing these conversations. So we certainly aren't seeing this as a one-off exercise. We publish a vision, we publish strategic priorities, though we are also, as officers, giving thought to those and starting to frame those in a way that will capture what the ambition is for the borough long term. But we're continuing those conversations. We'll be continuing those conversations with the voluntary and community sectors, with local businesses, and indeed with our staff. So there's going to be a round of engagement with staff led by the Chief Executive that will start this month. Because of course, apart from anything else, 40% of our staff live in the borough. So they are both residents and employees of the council. So they have a very immediate direct stake in all of this. And I think that point about continuing these conversations is really important. And of course, that's conversations very much with councillors as well. We will only be able to deliver this, and certainly for me, delivery is critical. We can have some very grand statements and ambitions, but if we don't translate that into action and activity on the ground and change on the ground for residents, communities and the borough, then this will only be a set of grand statements. So that work is starting and the thinking and the engagement is starting, but it will be longer term. So what you will see probably around January time, and of course we will have to take something to Cabinet and to full council, is emerging proposals around plans and delivery in terms of the medium and long term, but also a set of more immediate actions to deliver some immediate responses to what we're hearing from this engagement and from the other evidence that we have. So I hope that gives you a sense of immediate next steps. And as I say, you will continue to be engaged, of course, as councillors who are central to all of these developments.
Thank you.
In your presentation, I'm not quite sure what emphasis is placed on the general cleanliness and the absence of litter in the area. Now, I know most people like to be proud of where they live, particularly when they invite their friends around, that the streets are clean, there's no fly tip around or anything like that. What sort of emphasis is going to be placed on this in your report?
So the report that's out, I think that's really just headlines of our report that's now been produced. So you'll see in there how that's picked up, how that features. I think the survey is a place where you get to the best crunchy data on that, because people are asked about that and they give responses, and you'll see differences between areas as well, with different parts of the borough give slightly different responses on that, along with some things around not just cleanliness but around sort of safety and crime and other things too. So that kind of underpins, I think that's the basis for then the conversations we had through some of the more in-depth work, so the focus groups and the sort of deliberative sessions. I think just the point I made before about, and I think hopefully comes through in the report, which is that these are quite mundane things, but they are the things that underpin and sort of get in the way of people feeling more ambitious about other things. So people can think about the future in quite ambitious ways, but if they look out their window and see the litter and the fly tipping, it sort of just, it puts a bit of a limit on their ambition for other stuff. So whilst it's not the most interesting stuff in here in terms of like ambition for the future, it feels quite important to people to get that stuff sorted so they can then start to invest in other more important things. So hopefully that comes through in the report.
Thank you, Chair. It was really interesting and exciting reading this and the resident survey as well. I sort of digged deeper into this. I may follow up if it's all right with some other questions separately. But I've got a particular 2 points relating to page 31 when it relates to crime. So it'd be good to understand how statutory partners were engaged in both the pre-work and also the post sort of moving ahead. I'm just thinking here when some of the figures listed, particularly with concern to the East, Merton and Mitcham. So 53% concern about use of drugs and drug dealing and so forth. My second question is actually about the presentation of that information there, because certain figures are bolded where others aren't. So for example, clearly there's a concern about drugs, but also when we talk about Northeast Merton, there's an issue with vehicle crime with 53%. So can just some context about what that table is actually trying to present with that, or am I just reading a bit too much into that particular table? Thank you. That's in the full report.
In the full report, so not the survey report, but the kind of full, because there's one which is posted survey data, and there's one which is
just for clarification.
Okay,
this is the annual residence survey of the 1,000 strong sample, is it?
No, this is themes from commonplace and resident survey community. That's the headline, and it's page 31 of the.
Okay, I'll look at that. I think when we have when the figures are bolded, it's where the change is greatest on past data. So where on the survey that's the case, and on the survey report, or it's where there's a particular where the gap is biggest. So where something stands out. So in some cases the figures are quite similar between places, and then you'll find there's some areas there's a sort of outliers. So they're bolded normally for that reason, to show there's a difference in particular places. So yes, I think in those areas you mentioned, there's higher concerns raised around drugs and crime than other places. So therefore, that's why they were bolded. The point about the involvement of partners in the setup, I don't think particularly. I think with the survey data, certainly the survey was based on, as close as possible, a previous survey you'd done, so that there was therefore comparable data. So I don't think criminal justice partners would be particularly involved in the question setting or the data around that, but I'm guessing they were very involved in what happens afterwards, and that came to the conversation at the partnership this week, where there was lots that the police have to sort of say about some of this stuff.
If I could just add to that briefly, Chair, we did have an initial workshop with the Merton partnership very early on, before we started to commission the detailed work. And there was already, I think, a good level of interest and engagement there from the partners. And as Rob and I mentioned, we had a follow-up this Monday with the partnership to really start getting to grips with delivery, because, I mean, we're very clear from the council side that this won't be delivered just by the council. Indeed, it won't be delivered just by the statutory partners. Local businesses will be key to this, but so, of course, will communities and residents. And that's the other thing that I think will be really important, that we continue as part of developing this work, that we continue to engage with those communities and residents. And certainly I thought it was really interesting, the interest that Traverse identified from residents to be engaged and continue to be engaged. And I think there's lots of opportunities here. So if you think about the high streets and developing plans for the high streets, we could be doing things like setting up a pop-up shop in the high street to engage local residents in those neighbourhoods and that high street. That's just one possible idea. There will be lots of others. So that, I think, will be key to these developments, how we continue to, because if we get that engagement from residents and communities, we get their commitment to it, and we get their continuing interest in it, and hopefully a sense that it really is about delivering what they feel they need for their neighbourhoods. So that, but as I say, that's longer term work. We're not going to see that in the next few weeks. That will be months, and indeed some of it will be going into years.
Thank you. I thank you for the report and the presentation. I would have thought, had you asked any councillor, whatever their political hue, Lib Dems, Tories or Labour, they would have told you before this report the frustrations were litter and traffic. There was pride in the community and the green spaces, and there was a desire to reinvigorate the high street. There's nothing wrong with the report confirming what we already know. But Frank, I want to ask you, what in this report, if anything, surprised you?
That to me, sorry.
No, that's sorry. Actually, there were things that surprised me in this, because I've seen this sort of work done in quite a few other authorities, and I've seen the results of it. And I think it's useful to think about the residence survey slightly separate to this work, because I think this work that Traverse have done really digs down into some of what, and I'd accept the point, you know, litter, fly tipping, concerns about crime and safety. Those are all things you will see, and I would suggest every London borough, indeed most local authorities. But a couple of things that did surprise me about what came out of this. The first one was the sense that of high streets and the importance they played within neighbourhoods, and the sense of a community being focused on the high street. That was something I haven't come across before. I don't know whether Rob might have done in other work he's done. So that was really quite different for me. The other thing, which isn't necessarily new, but is this sense that residents have a substantial set of ambitions for their communities and their neighbourhoods. You'd probably expect that, but there's a bit of articulation of that coming through these findings, which I wouldn't say is surprising, but is important. So there are things about this that I do think are rather different. The other thing, of course, is that real sense of pride in the borough. That's not something you'll see everywhere, and certainly isn't something I've seen everywhere. So there are things about this that you're right, you would expect to see. It's useful, as you say, to have them confirmed, but there are some other things that are a bit different, and certainly for me were new and interesting and important.
Sorry, it's me again. Thank you, Chair. I'm just very fascinated with this stuff. Yeah, so just thinking more widely in terms of the next steps, just to ask another question about how people were feeling in this process as well, about the agency they felt they had in their local area, and what role they, in terms of was there any conversations that looked at the balance between their agency and what they expected from the council itself as an organisation or partners? What was that mix? Or was there any conversations in that detail? And also, was there any talk of concerns about the context that local authorities are in terms of resources, expertise, things like that as well? Thank you.
I don't think there was much recognition of the challenges that you face around resources. I think we often find that isn't the case when you talk to the public about things. And there's a mixed picture. On the one hand, people do want you to sort stuff out. People look at the council and say, right, council sort it out. And people talked about the council investing in the high street. Now, when you ask what does that really mean, people don't always quite know. They want you to go buying buildings, that they know that you don't run businesses, but people do expect you to sort of be able to do stuff, to pull levers, and we know that you can't always do that. On the other hand, yes, there is, I think, a sense of agency when you invite people to, it sort of depends, in our experience, how you ask the question. And it's like we ask people, what do you think about services? They'll tell you about public services and what they like and don't like. If you ask about what do you care about where you live, what would you change? If you left your area, what would you miss? Have different kinds of conversations. People start talking more about the things they can do and they would like to do. And I think some of the stuff you saw, just a few quotes there, around the perhaps pandemic experience, where people have been more locally focused in their streets and neighborhoods. They talked about the kind of planting up the gardens in the street and everyone getting involved, and or how important the local business on the high street was more than they had been in the past, because that's their only shop to go to. Those things come through that experience of the last 18 months. And I think that opens up conversations about, and therefore, what can we do locally to make stuff happen? So it probably is all the stuff, your words that are kind of thrown around how councils are enablers, not just doers anymore. But I think that is quite important to come through some of this around the question changes from what can we go and do to how can we network people together to have the conversations they were having through this work, and maybe then start to generate some stuff themselves. So it was opaque. I don't think that stuff was clearly coming through there, but we could see the seeds of that in the sort of stuff people were saying to us. But you could do a whole process on agency, but that wasn't kind of the focus of this. But yeah.
Oh, Thomas.
Just to pick up on Councillor Kohler's point again, I agree with him that getting things reaffirmed is helpful. But if one of the bits that has been mentioned that wasn't surprising is the litter in the street scene, why, as we heard in the earlier agenda item, has £250,000 just been spent on the street scene? Surely if that was the unsurprising bit, it didn't need this report to do something about it. I mean, probably more for the cabinet member than anyone, I would think.
So, well, first off, you're asking me to respond to someone else's conclusions of what they found surprising. So if you're asking, you know, there's two parts to that question. One is what did I find surprising and why didn't I done that beforehand? Not what someone else found surprising and why I reacted to that. And I think the first thing is it's easy when you do what we do to intuitively think you know and get things a lot, right? And I think that when you consider that the High Street Fund from central government only started about 3 or 4 years ago, I think there's actually the emphasis in the UK on the society, UK society on the need for the High Street is actually quite recent. Actually, it's only over the last 3-4 years that it's really people have been talking about it. And I think that it's important to think of how much that's gone from a creeping issue, as in something that's just there. You kind of know we're all a little bit annoyed with, you know, sort of out of town, you know, industrial estates, you know, there's lack of variety, to something that is really prescient and, present in the forefront of our minds. And I go back to what Frank said at the, you know, when he opened, which is this is a response to COVID, right? And the reason it's become more sort of in your face is because people have been living more locally during that period. A lot of people have been, not everyone, a lot of people have been commuting, but a lot of people have been living more locally and therefore looking to access those things. So I think people, you know, and I can't tell you, you know, sort of what surprises Frank or what doesn't surprise Frank, but I know that, you know, this has been creeping and it's grown as a result of COVID. Now, to answer your question of why didn't we sort of start acting on that sooner? Well, the answer is we did. You know what I mean? We started putting grants during the COVID crisis to deliberately tackle. We specifically focused the grants from central government on micros and smalls. We did parklets. We did extended sort of outsourcing. You know what I mean? That has been a focus for like a year and a bit during this COVID crisis. So I sort of disagree with the premise of your question that we haven't started responding to it sooner. You know what I mean? I think we all became aware of that particular issue and its increased importance, you know, sort of throughout this pandemic, and began, including, may I add, including people in Westminster, not just in Merton, and everyone has been kind of responding to that for the last 18 months, 2 years. So it hasn't begun now, it began previously.
No more questions. I have 3 questions that I don't want answered right now. They're points, I hope, for officers to think about. But I do note that a recommendation has to go to Cabinet on the 22nd of January. So we won't, although that's some time away, we won't really have another opportunity to comment on this. If I may, with the support of members, let's see if you're happy to accept these into the minutes. A place-based vision, which is what we're talking about here, is essentially local. So my question is, how scalable is this? Can it be scaled from the high street to the borough as a whole? My second question is, how will bridging the gap between the east and the west and the inequalities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic be incorporated into the, let me just say, the outcomes here? Vision might be a bit too much, but into the outcomes from this study. My third question is, does your Merton represent a snapshot of the borough at a particular and indeed at an exceptional point in time, i.e. during the pandemic, will it still be valid as behaviours that were driven by the pandemic start to revert back to something closer to what we knew pre-pandemic? I'm not saying things are going to go right back, but I think from some of the quotes, actually, it's clear that it was, for some people, it was hell being cooped up with the kids, you know, in a small flat. For a lucky few of us, it was a delight to walk across Wimbledon Common with clear blue skies, absence of traffic, and you know, it was that Wordsworth on Westminster Bridge moment, wasn't it? Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. And is there a danger, and I don't want an answer to this right now, that that's almost created an idyll which will be difficult to maintain, and that really we should be taking into account as we start to decide on what are the realistic outcomes and objectives we're looking for here. So with the consent, Paul, you want to comment there?
So can I just add one thing, actually? It's the danger, and we saw it beginning to happen then, of it sort of collapsing into a partisan discussion, particularly in an election year. What I'd like to say to all the politicians is I think the lesson from this is actually how we talk to our residents. It was the contradictions lurking there. The frustration with LTNs and the frustration with traffic was an obvious one. And I think it's incumbent on all of us. It's easy for us to say we do it better and then to say you don't know how difficult it is. And to an extent, both of those debates are true. But as politicians, I think we have to get better at communicating with people the compromises they need to make and join in, because there aren't easy solutions. And I think that requires all of us to take a rather mature approach to it, but maybe that's in vain, I don't know.
No, I'm happy to leave it there, Chair.
Let me, I mean, I do find this fascinating, but it was my day job at one time, this sort of stuff. So if I can say thank you very much indeed, Rob, for your presentation and clearly getting us thinking. We got a
Chair, I think Matt Burrows would like to comment on it.
Oh, okay, of course. Sorry, Matt. Yes, Matt. Do please comment. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. Sorry, just a couple of points really. So, as obviously head of comms and engagement, we've been heavily involved with the process today. Just a couple of points really to come back. So, you asked the question, Chair, is it still valid, given that we've been through a significant change during COVID? I think I just point to the resident survey. So the residents, I think it is still valid. The resident survey has been run as a benchmarking exercise every 2 years for certainly as long as I've been here, probably as long as Chris Witherington's been here, who runs it. So there is definitely an element of it that does allow us to benchmark against what residents have said in the past, and therefore gives us an idea of what the kind of change curve might look like. I appreciate that what we've done with the Merton exercise is much more significant and far wider. We've run focus groups. We've got that added level of kind of feedback from residents, and we've got qualitative data, which is as good at it, as any kind of quantitative data. But I'd certainly say I think it's still valid and it's still worthwhile. There was a question earlier on about are we aware that the members know this feedback? Yes, of course we are. So within my division, we manage the member inquiry service as well as the comm service. This has been an item on members' radars of all parties for some time. So we knew it, but I think it's incredibly valuable for us to have that resident data, that resident feedback, and for us to be able to point to a relevant data set like this, which we've never had before, which gives us a real basis to set a future direction on. And the final point I wanted to mention in response was that someone mentioned earlier on what surprised us. I don't think anything surprised us. but there is a very clear message there. Excuse me. There is a very clear message there about getting the basics right. So while we have to look at high streets and we have to look at economic growth and we need to look at employment and skills, there is also a very clear message there. We need to get the basics right around our green spaces, around our recycling, and around our collections. So I think it's valid, but we've got an item coming up which will sort of touch on this again. So I'm very happy to take any questions later.
Matt, thank you very much indeed. Okay, indeed. And Frank, thank you too for your time this evening. Okay, so we will now move on to your report, please, Matt. And yes. And no, and we do miss you being on this side, you know. Matt, do you want to? Can I thank you first of all for providing us with a written report, and that is appreciated. And it's good to see the breadth of what the work you're doing here. Do you want to say anything about it in advance, or just take questions?
Thank you, Chair. So I'll keep it very, very brief. I don't want to go through the report. Everyone's seen that and read it. I would pull out one or two kind of, well, maybe 3 or 4 very key points in a few paragraphs. The last time, I think it's been a year since I had the opportunity to come and brief the Scrutiny Commission. So that was around September, I think, last year. Obviously, at that point, we were in the middle of, or probably at the height of the pandemic nationally. We hadn't quite reached it locally. So there was a lot of work that went on into January, February, March, April, May with surge testing and those kinds of things. So it has been a busy year. Throughout that, I think we've been quite successful with COVID-19 communications. We've had at our peak, the council has managed to successfully engage with up to, well, between 65, 70,000 residents per week, primarily through digital channels. But that certainly is a step up from where we were when I last spoke to the committee in September. Since then, of course, we have had to move back a little bit towards business as usual. So Chris Witherington's on the call. He's been very involved with Frank and the policy team around Your Merton. So that's been a big focus for us. We ran, or at least sort of supported on a lot of that engagement exercise throughout the summer. We've now kind of started to look at what the emerging priorities for Cabinet look like and what the vision looks like, and we will refocus our kind of communication support around that sort of January, February time when we'll produce a vision document and update the website. So we have started to move back a little bit towards business as usual. If there's one thing I would point out is that we purchased the council's first digital marketing platform about 18 months ago, which we started to run a digital version of the magazine on. We're now up to, within 12 months, probably about 40 or 50,000 subscribers to a number of different digital signups. So we now run newsletters for council priorities around climate change, education, events, My Merton, and of course, public health. So I'd leave it there. I'll try and leave most of the time open for questions, but I think overall it's been managing the pandemic, but we've started to get back to business as usual. So,
yeah, Matt, thank you very much indeed. Questions for Matt? Aidan.
Thank you very much, Matt. I really enjoyed reading about the work you guys are doing, and obviously saw it during the pandemic and beforehand. So hats off to you and your team for all the stuff you've been doing. Got just 3 follow-up points. It'd be great to get some feedback on. So firstly, talk there about your marketing platform. Sort of with a marketing geek like myself, could you provide a bit more detail in sense of, you talking about email, does it integrate social as well in the sense of advertising? What's the breadth and depth of this, and what's your sort of, say, 6 to 18 month plan for utilising all the nooks and crannies and bells and whistles of this package? Leads into my second point about where do you see strategically the role of your comms team, both internally and externally? Do you see it as a behaviour change or an advocacy role? So, for example, we've had fireworks campaigns from RSPCA. Do you see the opportunities there to work with those sort of charities and third-party providers or government to amplify messages, or do you see it solely as particularly sort of building off these type of campaigns in from the resident survey we've just had? And finally, just about you gave us some stats about the number of people subscribed. Just thinking about the sort of Barcelona principles of comms and engagement, how are you measuring the outcomes of those behaviour change, or how can you access more resource or kit or whatever process to actually measure those outcomes to further prove the utility of you guys and hopefully get more resource to help change behaviours and support all the stuff we always bang on about?
Okay, no problem. So I guess to take them one by one. What does it do? The digital platform. So it's purchased through a company called Granicus, but it's part of the Gov delivery system. So it's pretty much the universal digital marketing platform that most of the London boroughs use. We purchased it in late 2018, and we started to get it going just after I joined, sort of 2019, 2020. What does it do? It's a multi-channel platform. So we've upgraded it since we bought it. But effectively, what it does, and I'm sure that all members will have signed up to a website or signed up to something they like, when that's a local club or a local organisation, and you get these emails that drop through. And if you're interested in them, then you pick them up and you open them. So the first thing it allows us to do is build a database of residents who want to give us their information. Want to give us their email address, so it's data harvesting to an extent. It allows us to do that proactively with people that want to engage with us, so it's not heavy pressurized marketing, it's very community engagement focused. And once people sign up to us, then they are able to sign up to a range of different items. So if they want to, they can sign up to a regular update via their email on climate change. They can sign up to an update on recycling. When we move into the new vision and the new priorities, they'll be able to sign up to various email updates about all of our priorities. But on top of that, and again, it's a really good question. On top of that, it also allows us to get a little bit deeper into digital marketing. So it allows us to run drip feed campaigns, predetermined and premeditated campaigns as well. So I guess to give an example of that to the Commission, let's say that you were to move to Mitcham and you'd come across from Wandsworth. When you moved in and you registered to pay council tax and you registered to give us your kind of details for voting, we would then be able to send you out a kind of predetermined drip feed campaign that would welcome you to the borough. It would tell you where your local parks are. It would tell you where your local school is. It would tell you what your recycling collection looked like, your schedule. It would enable us to tell you a whole load of information on a regular kind of drip feed sort of approach. And that could be over the course of sort of 3 to 6 months. So what is the plan? Which I think was the second question. The plan is to maximize that. So over the next year, if we can sort of create the capacity within communications, we want to play a real part in that digital transformation process. We should be able to offer you as a resident, if we know that we're going to be late collecting your bin on Thursday, then we should be able to send you an email and say, we'll be there on Friday morning. That sort of thing drives up satisfaction with the council, because it's not about whether or not we get everything right, it's about whether or not we keep people informed and we engage them about what's going on. Certainly if you live locally, you won't mind if your bin's a day late being collected, as long as we tell you about it and we kind of proactively communicate. So I think in terms of what is the role of the system, it's about providing information to residents. It's about driving their satisfaction by providing the right information to them at the right time, based on things like the resident survey. It's about promoting partnerships. So we've worked a lot in partnership with people like Don's Action Group last year to generate additional volunteers through our digital marketing system when we needed local volunteers to be able to support the COVID-19 effort. And it's about communicating the vision as well. So hopefully that answers most of the questions. In terms of measurement, we have a whole range of measurements. So we have the resident survey. Once we build a digital audience, we'll then be able to survey them as well. So hopefully we would be able to start surveying those people that are engaging with us through those digital channels. So the measurement should grow over time.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much for the work you've done here in terms of summarising the important work of your communications here. One part for me is that, you know, no matter how much you might sign up to all these things on social media and things, a core part of the communication set is the website. That's going to be a core part of where everyone goes back to or starts with this process. Could you just go over the website in general and how it connects to these processes and ways in which you're working to hopefully make it a bit smoother for users? It's a common complaint that I get as a councillor, that it's hard to know where to start on the website, even if they are engaged in many of these other newsletters or ways of engaging with the council. They kind of get stuck on the council website bit. So visions for the future, things you're doing now to improve it, or things that work actually quite well with the systems you've got would be nice to hear.
Of course, yeah. So I think the simplest answer to that is that there is an amount that the communications team works closely with the website team on. So that would be including things like landing pages, campaign pages, and some of our kind of our signposting work. But the website itself doesn't sit with the comms team. So the website and the transactions and the functionality of the website sits within customer services. We work very closely with them. So wherever there's a crossover, we will work with them. So you'll have noticed last year, for example, for about 3 months, we ran an integrated set of the website or section of the website for Merton Together, which is a partnership campaign. So we work very closely with customer services where we can, but the website itself.
Matt, if I may, a very specific question about next door. Sorry? Oh, okay. I thought you finished.
If I can come in on an answer that Matt, even though he's frozen there, is very aware that there needs to be more integration between the CRM, the website, and the communications function. Is something that they're going to be looking to do over the next sort of 18 months. They've been separate in the past, but as we're sort of moving towards increased digitization and internal sort of changes, that's something that we're going to be looking at, and Matt's very aware of. And he's back, and he's very aware of the importance of broadband as well.
Sorry, I froze. To be fair, that was
back, Matt. Yeah, good.
To be fair, I think that was my personal broadband. Owen's absolutely right. Yes, we work really closely with customer services. We know that we need to integrate it going forward. We're already starting to do that. We've got a lot of various groups that work across. So we've got, in terms of transactions, we've got a combined approach. We've got a combined approach to customer services online and digital and social media. So yeah, apologies. I got frozen halfway through the explanation. So.
Okay, so I don't know whether you got my question, but that it was about next door, and very specifically, what's been the experience of that? I mean, as a self-confessed addict of looking at pictures of missing kitties and the happy news when they reconcile with their owners, but it can come back and bite you on the backside, I've noticed, when you've got a narrative running. How's it worked out? How's it, you know, is it doing what you expected for you, or is it actually a difficult one to handle?
I think overall, there's no doubt Nextdoor's been very positive for us. It does present challenges, as you would imagine. So to kind of characterize Nextdoor, you've got Twitter, which is very much news, political, stakeholder focused, short, sharp, kind of issues that crop up and then die away. You've got Facebook, which is much more community and family focused. And Nextdoor has been something. So Nextdoor is a platform, excuse me, that we launched onto about 8 or 9 months ago. It has a very substantial reach across the borough. So within Merton, we've got something upwards of about 40,000 residents that are already registered on Nextdoor. And the beauty of Nextdoor is that you don't need them to follow you. So if you understand where they are and they're registered to a certain postcode, you can get a message that should somehow work its way through. So we found it very, very successful. It's successful for very specific issues. It's not the sort of platform you would talk about political priorities or funding decisions, all those sorts of things on. It is the sort of platform you would talk about fly tipping. It is the sort of platform you would talk about local roadworks or transport. So we're still learning. We're certainly still learning, but it's been a really positive addition. It takes a lot of work because you've got so many people on it. I think the first time we posted about recycling, we had something upward of 100 comments, which then takes time to respond to, but really positive, and we should definitely be there. Absolutely.
Paul?
Matt, on that point, is it fair to say that currently you much of your role as an information provider is sort of a one-way rather than a dialogue with residents? Is there more you could do to engender that sort of grown-up debate about the issues we have to confront as a community?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Kohler. Yeah, I think there is. I might ask Chris if he wants to come in and comment shortly. But the Your Merton exercise, and so I think Owen would probably agree with this as the cabinet member. The Your Merton exercise has really flagged up a need for us to have an ongoing engagement relationship with our residents. We currently manage that through, as you'll know, a series of community forums. They've been in place a long time, but there's so much more that we could be doing in terms of digital engagement, face-to-face engagement, ward engagement. So yeah, our thinking is at the moment we'll probably bring forward a new approach to community engagement next year that's based on what residents are asking from us from Your Merton. But I don't know if Chris, you had anything to add on that.
Yeah, I think Your Merton was very valuable as a learning exercise for us, particularly around using a digital tool to do that kind of more engagement type work rather than static consultation work where you're asking a set question. Doing open questions was quite a new activity for us to do that way. Traditionally, we'd have put people in a hall and done things with post-it notes, so we couldn't do that with the pandemic. But we're actually able to engage a much larger number of people by doing it digitally. So I think those sorts of routes and options will be things we'll be looking to explore and do more of.
Yeah, if I can. I think there's a thread to a few of these questions actually, which I think is really important to answer as a whole. And I think this is about the internal recovery and the way that the organisation does certain functions. And I think there are 3 functional areas that are worthy of note. And this speaks to, one is the sort of the response to Your Merton, and that's the SPD function, which is strategy, performance and delivery, right? And how we respond to this and how we go forward, regardless of which party's in power, regardless of who it is, that needs to be thought of more and needs to be done, right? And the community has a role in setting that function. There's a second function, which is often termed DDAT, so it's digital data and technology function, right? That in lots of places is about the use of data, understanding internally how we use it, but understanding the data externally, better use of technology and incorporating that into the customer services, the website and the various aspects thereof, right? We need to get better at that. We are not a good council at that, okay? And we do need to get better. That is an area that I am responsible for, and I 100%, and you know, people within the organisation are well used to me saying this, it is something that we now need to pick up the mantle and take forward. It's no point saying that we haven't done it in the past. We need to go forward and move forward into that space and have a proper DDAT function and its own sort of team within this organization. And then alongside that, that third pillar is what I would term sort of CP, so communications, engagement, and partnerships, right? Now, we've got a good communications function, and Matt's come in and done a sterling job, and there's people, and we've, you know, the exercise we spoke about earlier, that was an engagement exercise, your Merton, right? And we all know that one thing actually we do pretty, in fairness, we do well through MSVC and others, is the partnership function, but pulling them together is important, and that's going to need investment. And I'm really, one of the things that actually did surprise me, and didn't surprise Frank, but did surprise me about the Your Merton, was that people are prepared to do the trade-offs if they get the engagement, and people want to be part of that conversation if you involve them. So if we get those internally, if we get those three pillars right, and we get them as part of a broader family, so they're in the same area of the organization, and therefore collaboratively working, so that the CRM function is next to Matt's comms function, is next to the engagement function, but is also next to that strategy and performance function. I think what we'll see is an uplift in the way that we move these things forward, in accordance with the priorities that any of us set going forward, right? You know, and that's really important, because I think these are backroom functions. They're not, you know, talking about them isn't going to win you elections, but the result of them will change the outcomes, okay? And I think, you know, to use banking speak, I think those middle office functions have been a little bit neglected, and therefore one of the things that we need to do going forward is think more of those three pillars, build a little bit of capability in that space, and realize that it's a, you know, a force multiplier in the way we go forward. So a little bit of techie jargon, I do apologize, but I think it is a thread that I've heard coming through various questions tonight in how we respond.
So unless we have further question, I'll, on your behalf, thank Matt and indeed Chris on the call there, and Owen too for being here. Thank you very much. Which brings us just to the work program, doesn't it? Which is our next meeting is on the, let's get this, 19th of January. Thank you. Which is substantially budget, and I note that there's still the reserve meeting a week later in case we haven't got everything. You know, let's hope that won't be necessary, but we'll wait and see. So, thank you all. Thanks to our co-opted members too for being here tonight, and